That's a problem that Amos addresses, and that is that, sometimes obedience that we consider obedience may not be what God considers it. And that's why Amos is sent to preach. Just a little bit of background again. This is recovering old material, but Jeroboam II came to power in Israel and enlarged the borders and did all kinds of things. In fact, one of the things he did was make a very wealthy nation. And because of that, certain things happened. A merchant class began to set up. And the problem with newfound wealth, if you will, is it brings with it some ideas. Number one idea is that in a religious society, it may be viewed as a reward for righteous behavior. God is blessing us because of what we have done and what we have been, and therefore we have more money. There's sometimes that kind of connotation that people leave. But the second thing that it does is something that happens to us today, which is you want to start keeping up with the Joneses. So if our neighbor gets a new house, we want a new house. If they get a new car, we want a new car. And in fact, usually we don't want to keep up, we want to get ahead. So they have to keep up with us. That's a kind of a vicious cycle that comes along. And that's some of the undercurrent that's going along. The problem is, how do you get that money? And how is your life oriented to where you can be wealthy but still be religious at the same time? That got to be a kind of a crux point for Amos. So Amos comes along. Amos is a displaced prophet. I call him that for a reason. He's there, but he's not supposed to be there where he is. We're told in Amos chapter 1 several things about Amos. First of all, we find out that he is his time frame is during Jeroboam II, probably around 750. It talks about an earthquake. Everybody apparently knew about the earthquake except for us. We have no way of knowing there was an earthquake every other day, it seemed like. So how do you measure against earthquakes? Apparently they did this one. But during the time of Jeroboam, Amos becomes a prophet. And it is, he goes, it says, to Israel. He's talking to the 10 northern tribes. We're 25 years away from the destruction of Israel and the sending into Assyrian captivity. And so there's this gap that's there, and he's speaking to Israel. But the problem is, it says he is from a place called Tekoa. Now, Tekoa is in Judah. In fact, it's down close to the Dead Sea. If you look at this map, over here, this is the Dead Sea. And Tekoa is a little town southeast of Bethlehem. It's a long way from Jerusalem. It's not a religious center. It's not one of those places that people go because there's a temple there or because they worship God there. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, in 1947, somewhere in this area, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it happened because a shepherd boy had lost his sheep, and he took a break in a cave and found, and was throwing rocks at things, and when he broke it, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if your kid starts throwing rocks at stuff, it may be valuable. I don't know if that's what the answer is or not. But Tekoa is down there, and it's not much of a place. It's out in the middle of nowhere. And we find out that he must be a poor man. He must be a poor man because he has to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. First of all, it says in chapter 1 and verse 1, he's a shepherd. Now, a shepherd took care of sheep that had very fine wool. And that was a market crop for Israel that they made their clothing out of. But he also says that he was a herdsman, which has to do with cattle. And you know anything, you don't put sheep and cattle in the same place. That was what the discovery of barbed wire was all about. Keep the sheep and the cattle separate. And so he took care of cattle sometimes when he wasn't tending sheep, but it also says he was a dresser of sycamore figs. Sycamore fig was in the Mediterranean basin, and about one time a year, someone had to go there, cut the fig open so it would bleed to get rid of the parasites. And so one of the things he did was he had this traveling job in which he'd go dress these sycamore figs. But he had these 3 jobs. Think about it. He had 3 different jobs to keep him occupied. He had to. He had to survive somehow. And so he's in contact with all of these markets and these people. He sees the markets. He sees the wealth as it comes in to buy things and sell things. He sees how people act and how people think. And so he's very much aware of what the situations are. But also, he's not an official prophet. Now, there are a lot of people who read Amos chapter 7 and verse 14, and he says, I am no prophet nor prophet's son. And yet we call him a prophet. The difference is there were hired guns, if you will. The king would hire his own prophets to tell him what he wanted to hear. He wanted to hear from God. What does God say? And remember, I'm the king before you talk. That will color whatever is going to be said next. Well, what Amos says is, I'm not one of your hired guns. I'm not hired by the king. And I wasn't born into this thing as a coattail rider as well. He says, that's not who I was. And that created some problems. See, if he's from the south and he goes to the north and tells the north all of their troubles, how do you think that goes over? Suppose you don't know anybody and they walk up to you and say, you know something? I don't like the way you behave. Do you take their advice? After the Civil War, there was a group of people that came from the north to the south to exploit them, and they brought with them their bags, and they were made out of carpets. And they called them carpetbaggers because they came to exploit places they didn't belong. I can imagine he's a carpetbagger to Amaziah, who is the high priest in Israel. And he says, you go back home, you seer. That's sarcastic, as we're going to find out as we go into this a little bit further. But what he says is, I am a roaring lion. In chapter 3, he says, do 2 walk together unless they are agreed? What that means is your values are not the same. It's really hard for you to get along. If you put 2 people in a marriage that they don't have similar, if not the same values, they're going to be fighting all the time. I've done premarital counseling, and one of the things that kind of comes up is, suppose you're someone who wants to stay home and read a book at night, and you marry to someone who wants to go out and party all the time. How does that work out? Not well, because somebody's always going to be disappointed. And this is God and His people. How can God walk with you if you do not agree with God? If you're at odds with Him. And so he says, the lion is roaring. Does one roar without prey? Is he not hunting something? Is something not in danger if the lion's roaring? He said, I'm roaring because God is hunting you. And the roaring of the lion is important. The real issue with Israel is they thought they knew what God wanted them to do. They had already framed the reference that says, this is what God wants from me. Now, we do that today. We do things like, we say, well, I think God's okay with that. How did you decide that? Well, I just think that. And so we rectify our own behavior by saying, I think God's okay with it. But the problem is they did some very extraordinary things. They had sacrifices. They did those things. You remember in the Old Testament, they had these long lists of sacrifices. And for Amos, they have the sacrifices. They do all these. He says, your sacrifices come every morning and your tithes every 3 days. They're very fastidious in their religion. And on top of that, they have these solemn assemblies. And so they come together and they have church services. And they do all the right things at those church services. In fact, they sing at those church services. They're wearing out the carpets of the church building saying, "Oh, how I love Jesus." So it's not that they're not religious. We're not talking about atheists here. It's easy to talk about atheists. It's harder to talk about ourselves. Because Amos says there is a problem with you. The problem is you oppress the poor and you crush the needy. I like this in Amos chapter 4 and verse 1. Amos turns to the women of Israel. And he says, "Hear this word, you cows of Bashan." Now, how do you think those women took that? "Hey, you old cows, I want to talk to you for a while." Well, it's not going to go over real well, is it? But that's not the point. He's making the point that says, a wife has come to her husband and said, "Dear, I ordered some new furniture last week. It's coming from Damascus in about 6 weeks, but we're going to have to pay for it. So you need to get the money together to pay for it." He says, "And how am I supposed to do that?" He says, "I don't know. Go foreclose on a widow. I don't care." And so that's what he does. Puts a widow out in the street, sells her kids for slavery so his wife can have a new sofa. Now, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? That's what was happening. And then they say to their husband, "Bring that we may drink." You can almost see this. I'm laying on my couch of ease and saying, "Bring me another drink today, honey." They have gotten a life of ease and carefree idea. And so it says they trample the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end. The neediest among them, they exploited and used to get their own wealth. God has always had a special place for those at the lower end of the spectrum. He always expected Israel to take care of the poor and the needy. He said, when you glean the field, don't take everything, leave something. Why? So the hungry can go through it and gather. He wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, the poorest of the poor were taken care of and not used up and spent as human remains. That's kind of what we find out in the rest of Scripture. But they had this idea. It's a segmented view of their relationship with God. Sometimes we have this. We have church. It's on our calendar. It takes place on Sunday, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. It's on our calendar. But the rest of the week is open for us to fill in as we please. For a lot of people, they have a life that says, I give God what He wants when He asks for it, and I get to do the rest with my own life. And for Amos, that's the problem. It was God on Sunday and me the rest of the week. I don't have to connect my life on Monday with what I did on Sunday. That happens today too. So this is just as relevant in the 21st century. Jesus would say the same thing. He said to the scribes and the Pharisees, "Woe to you." He said, one of the things you do all the right things. He said, you tithe mint, dill, and cumin. You count on all those little seeds. He said, but you have neglected the weightier matters, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Those are all people things, by the way. How you treat people, how you forgive people, how you take care of people. He said, you have made sure you try to please God, but you don't really care about the people around you. He said, you should have taken care of those things without neglecting the other. And that's part of the difficulty. Second thing they have is trust issues. Now, I don't mean that they could not trust people, They couldn't trust God. Remember something, Jeroboam II had built a massive kingdom. They had enlarged the borders. He had built fortresses everywhere. And when you have a lot of power, when you have a big army, when you have big armaments, begin to start feeling like we can take care of ourselves. I don't have to appeal to God. God doesn't take care of me. I've got all these other things in my life. You know, it kind of bleeds over into everything else. Well, I've got a really nice house, and I've got a really nice job, and I'm pretty well taken care of. I always like it's the story of the rich fool. In Luke chapter 12, when Jesus tells the story, he said, he tears down barns to build bigger barns. I have much for many years. But he didn't realize he didn't have it. And that's what Israel has this problem with. They think they can stand apart from God and don't need him because of their military and financial power. Problem with wealthy societies, strong societies, is we begin to think of ourselves as self-sufficient. We have put all the things into place to take care of ourselves. This is what he says in Amos chapter 6 and verse 8. He said, understand, I hate those strongholds. God says that. I hate those strongholds. You think you're strong. You think you're powerful. You think because you have an army and you have these strongholds, you're going to be protected. You're not appealing to me at all. And so I'm going to deliver up the city and all that's in it. And yet, as important as they thought, it says that Amos says, but Jacob, he is so small. He is so small. He has no power. He is not. He's just tiny. He's easy to be brushed away. How can Jacob stand? He is so small. So what does God want? I always like the prophets can do this in a very succinct way. Micah does this as well as Amos does. He says, here's what God wants. I want you to hate evil and love good and establish justice in the gates. Take care of the people in your environment so that the Lord of hosts can be gracious to you. You'll notice what he doesn't say in that passage. Offer more sacrifices. Attend more worship services. Give more money. Hate good. Hate evil. Love good. Establish justice. When you peel it back, God says, I want something else happening there beyond that. James would say it this way. Religion is pure and unadulterated. Before God the Father is this, to visit the orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Not one thing about compliance with other things. There's a reason for that, and we're going to get to it. But to do that, God says, He gives Amos 5 visions. And it's to reinforce this idea that something's amiss in Israel. You know, visions are one of those things that we think are fairly mystical, but in Amos, they're fairly normal, it seems like. There's locusts, there's fire, there's a plumb line, there's summer fruit, and there's the Lord standing beside the altar. Those are the 5 visions of Amos. And the Lord asked him the question, Amos, what do you see? And Amos says, this is what I see. He's only describing what is there, and then God gives him the answer. The locusts, he said, I've sent locusts, and they destroyed the land. Were you not paying attention? He said, the Lord showed me. Behold, he was forming locusts when the latter growth was just beginning to sprout. And when he finished eating the grass, oh Lord, please forgive. The locust has eaten. Now, Do you not connect what has happened in your lifetime with what God has done? And he talks about fire. He said, fire has raced through the land. The Lord God was calling me for a judgment by fire. Are you not paying attention, Israel, of what God's trying to do? Of trying to turn you away. And then there's a plumb line. Plumb lines are kind of old things anymore. You know, plumb lines, they used to be very common in a carpenter's toolkit. Today we replaced them with lasers. You know, but a plumb line is really a string with a weight on the end of it, and you put it up against a wall, and you can tell whether that wall is leaning or not. Now, some walls it's easy to see leaning. We've got a wall on our patio that the foundation gave way a long time ago, and it's supposed to be like this, and it's like this, and the only thing that's keeping it from falling down is there's a gutter in the right spot. I will never lose that gutter, let me tell you. Only thing keeping it alive. But if you had a plumb line, you can measure it that way. Now, in 2008, we had when we did renovation here, in the auditorium is square, by the way. You do know that, don't you? It's not. We had a guy come in there and survey it because we were going to do some other things that I'm glad we didn't, because we're going to crack the foundation if we did them. But he took it and he said, it's out of square by 1 inch. How do you tell that? I can't look at it and say that. But the measure does. He says, I have hung a plumb line in Israel, and I am measuring my people, find out what their faithfulness is. And then he says, I will never again pass them by. No more chances. None. They will be laid waste, and the house of Jeroboam will be put down by the sword. I have measured Israel, they don't measure up. And then he says, what do you see? And he says, I see a basket of summer fruit. This is one that doesn't seem obvious because it's a word play. I don't know if you like word plays or not. I love word plays. My wife hates them. And so we don't do it often. I do a word play at our house. And she goes, I'm going, that's funny, you know that, don't you? You go, no, it's not. So I have to explain it. And if you have to explain a word play, it's not funny anymore. But, you know, that's what happens. And the word play here is with the word end and the word some basket of summer fruit. Summer fruit is a Hebrew word that's pronounced kayetz. Kayetz. The word end is kates. What did you see, Amos? I saw kayetz. Well, that's the kates. I saw the basket of summer fruit, and guess what? The end is coming. That was his way of trying to reinforce to where people could hear the difference and go, oh, I hear it. That something is like this. And there will be wailings on that day, and they'll be thrown everywhere. And then there's the Lord standing beside the altar. The altar was a place that you met God, but when God stood beside the altar, it was for destruction. And so it says, the thresholds will shake and be shattered upon the heads of the people. There's not going to be anything left. All of those things that they have not done for God are going to be held accountable one day. So 3 things happen. God warns. It's true today. God warns us. And then God will measure. Have you listened to the message? The biggest problem for us is you can hear what God has to say, but not listen to what God has said. So he's measuring life and saying, do you do what I've asked you to do or not? And so God measures. But the last thing is that God judges. When you haven't changed, this is what's going to happen. That's the story of Israel. In 25 years, they'll be destroyed. Now, why is that? It sounds pretty simple. It's pretty basic, but chapters 1 and 2, I'm going to go back to the beginning. It's not the best place, perhaps, but this is the best way, I think, here. Chapters 1 and 2, they have a recurring refrain. It talks about the nations. And you meet nations like Egypt and Syria and Edom and Moab and Assyria and all of these nations around. And there is a refrain that says, for 3 transgressions and for 4. That's a way of saying, there's too many of these to count. There's too many of them. I don't know what to say. There's too many of them. You can't say, well, this is a few. No, it's not a few. This is your life here. And when you read this, the brutality is absolutely tremendous. I mean, they talk about the Philistines taking iron threshing sledges, lay people down on the ground and run across them. It's like mowing across human beings with a power lawnmower. The carnage is terrible. The inhumanity is indescribable. And so he complains about all these people and how they're going to be destroyed. But then he comes and he talks about Israel. For 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Those who trample under the head of the poor and the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted, a man and his father go to the same girl, so that the holy name is profaned. He said, this is your society. Now, I'm going to take a big guess here. It says, by comparison, whatever Israel did doesn't sound as bad as what the Philistines did. We do that all the time. We justify ourselves by saying, well, at least I'm not a murderer. Well, good luck. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, I haven't beaten my wife. Hey, that makes you moral, ethical. You see, we want to look at the worst and say we're a lot better than they are. And Israel was doing that. Just go, we're not as bad as the nations around us, so why are we having to suffer the way they do? We're God's people. The answer is, the greater the privilege, the greater the responsibility. When God has given His love and His care for you, He expects more from you for those who haven't felt it. The obligation of grace is to respond in a deeper way. God doesn't love us because we're so great. He loves us and expects something in return. The greater the privilege, the greater the responsibility. And so when Amos speaks, he says things that we all need to hear. He says, if the heart is not right, the actions are always going to be wrong. There are people who do the right things for the wrong reasons. When you do the right things for the wrong reasons, they don't count. When you would help someone across the street so that you can be noticed, think what Jesus had to say in Matthew chapter 6. He said, when you give alms expecting people to say, aren't they generous? You have lost what God wants you to do. The alms don't count then. When you pray so everybody can say, oh, isn't he such a wonderful prayer leader? He says, then you have lost what value was in that. He said, if the heart is not right, the actions are completely wrong. That means you always have to look not at what we do with actions, but why we do what we do. Why we do what we do is hard. Because it's easier to measure what we do. We like analytics, by the way. It's easy to measure your Christian life this way. By the number of worship services you attend, by the amount of money that you give, by the amount of fellowship you go to. You can measure those. Those analytics are there. You can sit there and weigh, count, and measure and say, well, look at what I've done. How do you measure compassion? How do you measure love? How do you measure commitment? See, those are harder to do. And if you're not careful, we'll drop down and start counting things that don't really count as high as the other does. Because if the heart is right, the actions will always follow. See, one of the things that Amos says is not quit doing all that stuff. Quit having your worship services. Quit singing those songs. Quit doing that. He says, I want you to start with your heart, change it. If you change your heart, the outcome will be better. This is what happens in marriages. We're going to talk about marriages next week when we get to Hosea. Because Hosea is all about marriages in one way or another. If you really want to improve your marriage, you're a husband, start loving your wife the way she wants to be loved. And if you're a wife, start loving your husband the way he wants to be loved. And if you'll do all of it, if you'll start with the heart, the actions will follow. It's one of those paradoxes that people do. I mean, they go, well, what do I do to have a happy marriage? Love the people. I always liked the story about the woman who had it with her husband. And so she went to the local preacher and she says, I want to divorce my husband. He said, well, that's simple enough. Why don't you just go do it? He said, no, you don't understand. I want to divorce my husband, but I want him to hurt so badly in the process he'll never forget. He'll say, okay, here's what you do then. You go home and you fix him his favorite meal every night. And you make sure his bed is taken care of, and you tuck him in and you let him sit in his finest chair, and you tell him you love him every day, and you love on him and things. And he said, then come back and see me. So she does that for a couple weeks. She comes back to see him. And he said, did you do everything I asked you to do? She said, yeah. He said, okay, good. Now divorce him. It'll crush him. She said, I can't. I love him too much. And there's some answers to that. If you do the right things, the actions will follow. This is what the writer of Proverbs said. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. Start with what's inside and let your outside life come from it. Not the outside life and hope to get the rest of it at the same time. Next week, we're going to come to a prophet of relationships, Hosea. Hosea goes through a very difficult period of his life, and that he has to marry a woman that no one would want to have to marry. And it's not about his marriage. It's about something else. And so next week, we're going to study Hosea, one of my favorite prophets. And I hope you'll be here to join us. And I'll see you again next week.